Hello, everyone, and welcome to the newly reformed Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. Ooh, I am excited to dig into this. I told myself that we were going to do some shorter intros here in the new year, and watch this not happen. I have such an exciting guest today, and I don't know how we didn't get connected sooner, seeing as we are both butchers, we are both avid readers, and this guest took me on what has ended up being one of, I think, 3 podcasts that I've recently recorded that is a deep dive into the history of why our food system is the way it is. And this actually wasn't a topic that I was intentionally seeking out. It's just something that sort of bubbled up into my consciousness or into the consciousness of my guests and ended up being a really big point of conversation. And whenever that happens, especially with it happening over the course of 3 back-to-back guests, where that's not what I thought we'd talk about, it's kind of fascinating that maybe this just needs to come through and maybe this needs to be heard. And our guest today, James Connolly, who is the producer of films. You might be familiar with his film Sacred Cow. And he is so much more than that. This man is a butcher. He ran an incredible nonprofit for a long time. He's a father, and he's just a really well-read guy. And when I say this, it doesn't happen too often that I come across somebody that makes me feel not very well read. And James is so well read that it was just very striking, and I couldn't believe the amount of information that was in his brain. So with that being said, there is a resource list a mile long on the webpage for this, and there is a limited resource in the show notes. So if you're looking for the full list of books that get mentioned, that's on the episode webpage. And it's just so exciting. We dive into, and we're going to, in this conversation about history over the next couple of podcasts, we're really going to dive into some controversial territory. And I know that's something that I don't like to shy away from, and I haven't shied away from on this podcast, though I always feel a little bit of when I put it out there. And one of the things that we dive into in today's podcast that I want to give you a heads up on is we dive into the medicalization of human experience and talking about the deep history of psychological medications, something that I have a lot of personal experience with. And this conversation is not meant in any way, shape, or form to shame anybody who has used these medications in the past, who does use these medications in the present. This is not a place of shame, and it's not us judging your decisions. It is really just looking at the historical perspective of how these medications came about and exploring the scientific studies related to their efficacy. One of the things I like to tell people, however, is that the most effective treatment for you is the one that you believe in the most. And so don't let this shake anything that you don't want shaken up. But if you're ready for a little bit of a shakeup, it is here. And we really just get into it, and hopefully it has a flow. And if you stick with us, we do keep returning to topics and kind of wrapping this up with a bow. I think I could have talked to James for a very long time, so it's a longer podcast, and it is just a very fun podcast, and I cannot wait for you to dive in. If you haven't seen Sacred Cow, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with it. It's an incredible book by Diana Rogers and Rob Wolf. It's an incredible film. James is also known for A Taste of Sky, Bloodroot, Transmilitary, Mole Man, and is just an all-around pretty awesome dude. I think you're going to really enjoy his take on things. Okay, I want to do our first ad of the new year. And again, this is in reciprocity. I think that the beauty of ads is that the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast is brought to you by Home of Wool. One of the things I like to consider is the fabrics that are touching my body the most. And there is no time when I'm in contact with something as long as when I'm sleeping. That's why I trust Home of Wool with all of my sleep related needs. Home of Wool carries mattresses, pillows, crib mattresses, duvet covers, but also cushions and rugs that are all made from organically raised wool. Now, they are Ecotex and GOTS certified and have a wide range of ability to customize everything. In fact, my custom length and width body pillow just came from Home of Wool. It has a 100% wool covering, which means that it's mold and mildew resistant, that it is fully compatible with my body to the point that there are studies that show that sleeping on and with wool actually brings your heart rate down. These are the fabrics that we have evolved sleeping with in contact with animal fibers, and they are so amazing because they breathe when it's hot and they keep you warm when it's cold. And I am just so impressed with every piece I have brought home from Home of Wool. So if you are interested in getting one of the best sleeps of your life, the best night of sleep of your life, you can use my code Kate Kavanagh. That's just my name, KATEKAVANAUGH, for 10% off your order with Home of Wool. Just use my discount code Kate Kavanagh for 10% off and dive into how wool can help you get the best and safest sleep for your family. The Mind, Body, and Soil podcast is also brought to you by Farm True Ghee. Farm True Ghee is my favorite cooking oil, and if you're starting the new year with a resolution to ditch seed oils, or if you're embarking on a Whole30 or an animal-based 30, ghee is one of my favorite resources. It's great for high heat cooking. It's packed with vitamins A, D, E, and K, and Farm True's ghee is 100% grass-fed and grass-finished, sourced from small family farms across the Northeast. It doesn't stop there, though. Farm True also carries an incredible line of Ayurvedic body products and many different concoctions made with their ghee. It is such a powerhouse, and I just put the ghee on my face too. If you want to explore this, I have a 15% discount using the code KATECAV. That's the beginning of my name, KATEKAV 15. That's KateCav 15 for 15% off your order from Farm True Ghee. I can't wait for you to experience the magic that is Farm True.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just trying to get an overall sense of it. As you sort of pull back and you do a 30,000 foot viewpoint on things. Whenever I kind of talk about things, I feel like I lose people because they don't understand my point of view on what I'm talking about. And so sometimes I'll kind of want to start out with this idea that like maybe civilization was a huge mistake, right? And so like if you're studying this stuff and we say, all right, well, like what happened to us? Why are we, one of the general absurdities that we have nowadays is that we're afraid of the sun. We're afraid of dirt. We're afraid of the water. We're afraid of, too much sunlight. We're afraid of any number of different things and we're afraid of foods that we've eaten for over 200,000 years, since the dawn of time. And so, like, if you look at the absurdities of that, you have to sort of pull yourself back and you have to say, all right, well, why are those people asking these questions? Why are they looking at it in this way? Why do we look at the world as a sort of why is it when we look at this sort of future perfect idea, why is it always a sterile, clean environment that we're sitting in? A white kitchen with tablespoons and everything looks like a laboratory experiment, and it's a clear antiseptic sort of bubble boy environment that is supposed to be this thing that is driving us into the future. And that is so abhorrent to me. Like, every time I see that, Frederick Leroy has this beautiful meme that he puts out, and it's a bunch of Mongolian kids who are sitting around and they're eating meat, and they've got blood all over their hands and all over their face, and they're eating just raw meat. And then he has this sort of Kellogg's Rice Krispies girl sitting and having breakfast, and the whole environment is just like, perfectly lit and clean and all of that stuff. And you have to ask yourself, why is one abhorrent to us? Why do we have shame and disgust with the first one? And how much of that stuff is sort of taught? When I was teaching in schools.
Like, when did that what is the genesis of that abhorrent, shame-filled feeling around it?
Yeah, and some will say Upton Sinclair, the jungle. They say that there was a period of time when you had this sort of industrialization of everything sort of happening, and now you had these huge stockyards filled with making sausage, and the Chicago is kill floors, and he was a socialist. He was actually talking about workers' rights. He wanted to get an understanding of how Chicago was playing out in terms of the people who were super wealthy and the immigrant population, mainly Eastern Europeans and Germans who were going there, who were literally dying, producing a lot of this food. And so he was looking at it from a very specific point of view. He said, I'm trying to teach about sort of workers' rights, and these guys were working 6.5 days a week and killing themselves for food. And what he ended up doing was hitting us in the stomach. And it created a whole sort of a new system of laws that were implemented that were centered around sterilization and cleanliness. I hit them in the stomach, which is what he said. And so that sort of was a sort of galvanizing property that became kind of part of the mythology that now exists nowadays, that gave rise, I think, in a lot of ways to the processed food movement, because the processed food movement came in and said, wait a second, what we can do is we can create the same product. We're going to produce it in a laboratory, right? And it's going to be, cotton seeds and, all of this stuff. And when it comes out, we're going to be in white lab coats. There's no blood anymore or anything like that. And we're going to just give you this thing that is the product of the modern environment that doesn't have any of that stuff anymore. And for him, I think it was like, I'm sure he was like, totally like, rolling over in his grave afterwards, just seeing the modern world that was sort of created off of that. Yeah.
I have this question, though. Why were we ripe for that idea when for hundreds and thousands of years of human evolution, we've been close to the dirt and we've been blood on our hands? There had to be there had to be some cultural impetus that was creating, the right breeding ground for that idea to be like, okay, I want this cleanliness. I want this sterility.
I think that what Upton Sinclair did was he crested the wave. What ended up happening was the creation of that wave was the 19th century. So the 19th century, what you start to see, and you actually see this for close to 200 years before that, you see this within the context of industrialization that had, in England and in certain places in the West, what they called the sort of closing of the commons. There used to be you used to have sort of herding cultures used to have people very associated with farming. Farming was, 90% of the workforce worked in farming. And when they tried to sort of push people into factories to start to make, all of these factory products, the level to which nobody wanted this was so high that in essence they had to kind of close off the spaces by which these people could live and live by themselves. And so what you had taxation that would happen that would happen periodically during harvest or any number of different times during the year, where you would get something associated with the imposition of rule of law from your hierarchical kings and queens and dukes and everything like that. Now you had to, in essence, sort of force people into these factory systems. And the way that they could do that was to outlaw hunting, to outlaw, any sort of way of life, and to say that these people are actually living the wrong way. And so you start to institute educational practices that say these people don't know anything, right? Obviously, they're living on their own, and you could actually see this. You could see this in writing at the time. I forgot the writer who was talking about it. The book is called The Invention of Capitalism, but he was talking about the fact that he would go up into the Scottish Highlands and these men would never work, right? They would just hang out all day. And when they got hungry, they would go and just shoot a rabbit and they would cook by the fire and they would just feed themselves and they would just do all this stuff. And he said this was laziness, right? These are people living, according to their own means and, and communally. And he said, this is abhorrent to me. And so you force them out of that way of life. You force them and you shuttle them into cities and into factories. And now you have to teach them how to live. And so you saw this primarily in the 19th century. You see this with the advent of a lot of more industrialized farming than we had seen before. We see this in invention of the cotton gin, but we also see this with a number of different implementation tools. But then you also saw people being forcibly shuttled into cities where they had to work. And so now they're divorced from how their food is made. And as soon as you can do that, then you start to be able to have a level of control over any aspect of their lives. And so, like Daniel Quinn kind of talks about this, he said there really, within all of the cultures of the world that we live in today, there's really only two. You can say there's just monumental differences between all of them. He said there are people who hoard and control food, and there are people who don't. Right? And so we've set up this divide in civilization, and now we're all, in essence, sort of working to bring home the bacon in a way, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll pause for a second.
Fascinating. No, I think pause for a second, and we should introduce you, but I have to say this first because I think that something else happens at the end of the 1800s that changes the narrative, which is antibiotics. Penicillin is discovered, and there is a different tilt towards how we can cure illness, how we can cure something that, feels dirty or feels unclean. And I mean, infection is to some degree. And you see a rise of drug companies at that same time. And you see the Pure Food Act that preceded the Food and Drug Administration in the United States come online right around World War I. And I think that likely also fed into that narrative. But I'm fascinated because I do think that divorce of humans from autonomy to feed themselves and to live in a way that feels closer to the natural state of what it is to be human. It opens the door for us to be mass educated and in a really particular way, and to be just kind of detached from our own sense of meaning. And you have the perfect ripe situation for industrial processed food to step in. And once that is proven to be incredibly profitable, I think you kind of have a runaway train.
Yeah. And there was during the time actually a huge pushback against that. There's a book called The Poison Squad that goes into, what is his name? I think it's Harvey Wiley. He was one of the first food scientists. And so I don't know how he did it. He convinced a number of different people, I think it was like 12 men, to go and sit down and eat a number of different foods that were considered sort of poisonous at the time.
Yes, 12 healthy men. No,
12 healthy men.
Healthy men, yes.
Yeah.
And to eat very poisonous things over the course of a year, and to document their complete degeneration.
Yeah. And for some of them, it was like, cause mild gastrointestinal distress, which probably was not mild.
No, I don't think
but it's
it
very
was.
19th century phrasing. But there was a lot of sort of play, especially when people remove from the farming system. Then you start to get a lot of doctoring of foods. You would see this in milk, in flour. You saw this in a lot of different foods. So people were actually getting sick from foods. Coffee, there were any number of different things that were being doctored in order to produce, just a cheaper commodity. And so, you saw, in some ways, there was a case that happened. It was. I kind of want to go through the narrative of it. He was.
Do it.
Let's see if I can kind of remember this. I read a lot. So there was this Frenchman who kind of came over, who was a total scam artist. Right? He was just going from scam to scam to scam to scam. He was one of the first really sort of popularizers of margarine. He ended up being prosecuted in Chile for selling fake butter. And he ended up going to jail for it. And so you kind of look at it as like the pushback on this from Harvey Wiley, who was, I think, very much against a lot of these really adulterated foods, or foods that were imitation. They used to actually have to call these food margarine imitation butter. And the industry fought really hard against it, because nobody's going to sit there and buy imitation butter. And so they fought really hard against this. As soon as this stuff started to be enacted or the laws were starting to write about what is a pure food and drug, you saw the industry essentially just manipulating all of it. And so what you saw was a period in time that I think is actually a crucial period, where we could have had probably one of the most amazing food systems. This is prior to Ansel Keys, right? We could have had an amazing food system that actually looked at real food, tested it, used all of the new technology and chemistry to figure out whether people are selling real and fake stuff. And the U.S. government just made it completely banal, and destroyed the possibility of and opened the door for a lot of these fake foods. But this guy, and I'll send it to you for the show notes and stuff like that. It's a really interesting story, because the 19th century did have certain degrees of adulteration. But what you started to see was, so now you have people fundamentally removed from their food system in many different ways. And they're starting to build these communities that were sort of like these vegetarian communities that were supposed to be an antidote, because they were blaming meat for a lot of the ills that were actually happening. You get somebody like Kellogg, who, in essence kind of created a food that he called, he wanted something that was already pre-digested. That's the reason why he actually made the food. So his invention for cornflakes was you crush it, you masticate it, you do all of that stuff, and then you dry it so that when it enters into your mouth and goes onto your palate, essentially pre-digested. That was supposed to help you with your digestive process, because the notion was that your digestive system was so compromised that you couldn't digest foods anymore, and it was all just being evacuated. So he creates this pre-digested food that then fundamentally kind of takes over the space, right?
I hadn't thought about
and we
it
can go into
terms.
Kellogg in many different ways.
I know he's quite the character, but I hadn't considered the pre-digested aspect of things. That there's an issue fundamentally with our digestion, that we can improve this because there's a waste product at the end of that.
I mean, he's like, I think he actually fundamentally understood so many of the aspects of what we're talking about today. So when we talk about the probiotic and biotic movements and all this other stuff, he actually understood that the fiber and all of those things needed to be, in essence, sort of broken down. And he presaged the Doritos movement, the hyper ultra processed movement, by close to 70 years. So how do you make a food hyper palatable? Is you, in essence, you pre-digest it, and so it has no texture, it has no mouthfeel. It dissolves in your mouth. Your body doesn't recognize it as food. It never hits a satiation response. It was never his intention, but he did understand that there was certain elements in the digestion process that seemed to people when they were eating foods that they would have, they would have gas, they would have any number of different, the man was obsessed with bowel movements. He recorded all of his daily bowel movements. He invented a machine for the colonic. He did not invent the colonic. He actually studied with a guy who was a huge popularizer it. But he created a machine that what was it, somewhere around 15 gallons of water per minute up your digestive tract. So, like 15 gallons a minute.
Wow, I don't even know where to put that. I don't even know if that's what my faucet does.
Full blast, like a fire hose. Right? And, everything is about cleanliness, right? So again, we're going back to this idea of cleanliness. You can create a palated diet that is clean, right? It doesn't have blood anymore. It doesn't have any of these things. These are like foods that you open a box, inside of that box is a laboratory made food. All you can see footage from the 1920s of Kellogg's stuff. Everybody is in white lab coats. Everybody looks like they're scientists. And so you're creating this thing that says, listen, we are humans. We are divorced from nature. We've ascended to this medium now where we actually aren't really dependent upon it anymore. And cities are kind of the archetype of that, because cities are, I think New York, by some estimates, has maybe 3 days worth of food if the whole system just shut down. 3 days to feed, 8-9 million people. And so it can live in this world where you get, say, the presidential candidate, Michael Bloomberg, will say, he said, well, what happened in modern day society was that you had this enormous brain drain. All of the smart people moved out of the rural space, in agriculture, and all the smart people left, and they all moved to the cities. And
Did
you can
Bloomberg
say that.
Say this?
Yeah, he said this.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And seriously, fuck him, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be so divorced from the reality, because his daughter is a championship horse rider. I think at one point she was competing in the Olympics. Like, he has to be able to go and see her on his multi-million-dollar, farm, and to see, agriculture in and of itself, and just see the inputs that are designed in order to create this, multi-million-dollar horse that can jump over a fence or something like that. I don't know what they do.
Maybe, but I would argue, anybody who's driven through horse property, like true horse breeding property, I would argue that it's quite divorced from agriculture.
Right.
That those are annexes of, honestly, a sterilized view of agriculture. The horse being, I have no idea how it made it to this point. It has a very inefficient digestive system, and we've taken it and bred it to this standard and shaved it so it's nice and sleek and tight. And so I would actually put that within the bounds of sterility in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the same way they're British bulldogs, right?
Mm-hmm. We have manicured little fences.
Yeah,
and these breeds that they can barely breathe. Yeah, they're just for our human pleasure. And I have horses, so I'm not knocking horses. I am, as grazers, knocking horses. I'm knocking them. They're bad grazers. But that being said, I think that's another hallmark of sterility. I don't think Bloomberg has experienced that. I don't think he sees it in the drive from his back seat. I don't think he looks up from his phone and has considered it.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at these things from the financial perspective, right? That I know we're ranging from a bunch of different places, so we can jump back and forth between it. But when you look at the financial aspect of I want to constantly go back to the divorce between the city and rural communities. Chicago is also the epicenter of the commodities sort of movement, right? So you have the agricultural exchanges that were happening that really actually took off during the Civil War. In essence, the stock market in many different ways, right? Stock.
Yeah, the
right?
stock.
So,
well, no, that was the genesis of the stock market. It was stock, livestock.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get the grain exchanges as well that were sort of part of that sort of gave rise to the modern day agricultural commodities movement that is in essence sort of like fundamentally reshaped our world. When you talk about corn and you talk about soybeans and you talk about like wheat or anything like that, what you need is a total sterile monoculture that is produced over and over again in order to create wealth for this financial system that trades these things as if there's no genuine inputs or anything that doesn't necessarily matter. By the time it reaches them, it's just poundage and price, And so, like, for me, my God, that took me like 3 years to go through the entire commodities exchange movement, starting with the Phillips brothers and all of that stuff to even just get like some degree of global perspective on that, because that is a monster. And these guys have made just enormous amounts of wealth off of, one, taxpayer dollars, and two, the backs of farmers. And they've utilized it in many different ways to, in essence, sort of destroy our agricultural system. And since 2008, what they actually felt kind of fine with, kind of touching for a very long time, was that they would leave farmers at their fence post. And so farmers at least had their, the boundaries of their farm to be generally kind of left alone. But since 2008 and the mortgage-backed security crisis, they have now viewed this as the new sort of frontier. And they have leveraged enormous amounts of capital to, in essence, turn farmers into serfs again. I mean, that's the way I describe it. But we can go into that as well.
I think it's the only... well, honestly, my jaw's on the floor a little bit just because your wealth of knowledge and all the directions it's coming from, that you spent 3 years diving into commodities alone is just kind of it's fascinating to begin to put together. And something that you said, I think, before we hit record was this worldview of how our food system has kind of tumbled. And I think that so frequently on these podcasts, we discuss it from a very United States, North American perspective. And to get a bigger picture of how we got to where we are and what that means is... I think that's fascinating, and I think it's important, especially as we begin to look at, I think, a return to serfdom and farmers and a complete lack of land ownership. And I think that you see this happening not just in the United States but the world over. But just to put this into everything and to how we as culture have formed our viewpoint of something, because I think that viewpoint right now, that space that we're coming from, and you said this at the beginning of the interview, that you wanted people to understand your viewpoint, where you're coming from. And I wonder if as a culture, do we understand our viewpoint, because it's been so baked in from our education and from the culture we were raised in and from just everything about our lives. Do we understand where we're coming from at this point in time? And so I think what you're doing is incredible, and I want you to keep going. But does that make sense? Like, do we even know what our viewpoint is anymore? Like, where we're coming from? Do we have enough context? Do we have enough historical knowledge? Do we have enough cultural knowledge to understand why we're making the choices and forming the opinions that we're forming?
Yeah, and I think in some ways, like, the I, God, there's so many different directions I want to go. All right, let's just all right. Let's do I'll do the story of the Great Grain Robbery. Because I think the meat mafia guys actually do a really good job of distilling some of the aspects of what happened with Nixon, and the Earl Rusty Butts, and
we've
all
talked
this
about
stuff
that a lot on this podcast too.
So. Okay, so the Great Grain Robbery is have you guys talked about this at all?
No.
Okay. So, and it's an interesting story. I do not in any way say that I have a good understanding of it, because the way the commodity world works is a lot of them are private companies. They will sometimes kind of do like a prospectus, and an internal perspectives that people will be able to get their hands on. But for the most part, they sort of operate internationally and sort of within the bounds of some of the aspects of our financial system, but for the most part have figured out ways to circumvent all of that. And so when you're talking about, so A, B, C, and D, ADM, Bungie, Cargill, and Dreyfus, some of the largest commodity exchanges in the world, you sort of have to take a step back and go all the way back to kind of where the beginning of this kind of happens. And it's in the sort of 1960s. Russia had gone through, I always love telling this story, and I have to kind of stop myself. It's like, do you have 3 hours of your life? Russia's agricultural program was based off of this weird guy by the name of Trofim Lysenko, who caused probably one of the worst famines in all of human history. He may actually be responsible for more deaths in the 20th century than anybody else. He fundamentally believed in an agricultural policy that was based on communism. And so he said something to the effect of, well, plant species of the same species would never really fight for resources, so that you can actually just grow wheat as far as the eye can see, and you would never have to put inputs because they're never going to fight for resources. He caused enormous damage. Stalin, so we know up until this point that perhaps maybe between 4 and 6 million people died in Ukraine, because Stalin, in essence, took whatever harvests were left and whatever bumper harvests they had before Lysenko's agricultural policy was put in place, was excised and exported so that Stalin could get enough money to build his own industrial revolution to compete with the West. And so when you get something like the Holodomor, which is talked about in Ukraine, is not talked about in Russia, you have this massive famine that happened. If you want to watch a film on it, there's a film that came out during COVID. It was called Mr. Jones. And it's about this intrepid reporter who actually snuck into the Ukraine and saw what was going on. It's really hard to watch. So Lysenko's policies were... Oh, did I lose myself? Hold on.
Take your
Can we
time.
pause it for a second?
Yep.
I don't know where it went.
No,
Hold on one
know.
second.
I'm not on a tight. I'm on farm time.
Cool. I hate these things. Okay. Where were we? So Lysenko's policies, I'm actually really good. So Lysenko's policies were exported to China, and we don't know how many people died. Somewhere between 30, maybe 40 million people died. And so sort of give it an impression of this. The Lysenko had fallen out of favor by the 60s, and Stalin had died. There's a really interesting story about it. If you want to really dive into it, you can kind of look into it, because you have the agricultural minister beforehand. His name was Vavilov, who's actually a total hero of mine. This guy traveled all over the world, and he created one of the first seed banks. it just created this. If Russia had sort of followed his policies, I think, and none of this stuff actually would have happened. But Lyshenko ended up kind of taking over, and he sent Vavilov to a prison camp, and he died of starvation. And so you see, so by the 60s, Russia needs reserves of grain. And this is the height of the Cold War, right? So you have all of these different sort of Cold War policies where we have nuclear arms proliferation. We're fighting this thing, and we go and these Russian diplomats come over to the United States, and they're like, "Hey, we want to buy some grain," and so. So these commodities brokers all get together. The Phillips brothers, I think, were the ones who were initially involved in it. They end up selling the grain to Russia. And Russia, these diplomats bought from a number of different commodities dealers. And what the commodities brokers knew was that it would send the price of grains and bread and supermarket staples through the roof. And so we exported enormous amounts of grain to Russia. So then what happens is the Phillips brothers actually end up getting kind of caught up in this. They're sent in front of Congress, and they say, oh, well, actually, I mean, it really wasn't our fault. We ended up losing money on the deal because these Russian guys were so good at, buying all of this stuff at bulk. But lo and behold, what they had set up was a commodities brokerage in Switzerland, where they had voted hedged their bets against the prices, and they made a ton of money. And so they started to realize they could leverage all of this these different sort of the Swiss model of economics, the way that they allow for taxation and, any number of different, if you want to study the Swiss economic model, it's an absolute mess. But what they could do, so they started to build this sort of commodities movement, and they in essence forced the U.S. government through Nixon and through Butts, who was told to control these prices, forced all of these farmers to get bigger, get out. And what happened when they got bigger, get out was that you get a huge takeover, and you start to get this sort of manipulation of the farming market towards more industrialization and more monoculture, which just creates more and more profits for these commodities brokers. And then they start to get into anything that could be sold at bulk, so from gasoline
Orange
to,
juice, pork bellies,
copper, cobalt, everything,
Sure.
all of
Okay.
lithium, every single thing, and they created their own sort of market for this world where they sort of, they have gone into almost every place on the planet, and been able to leverage their power in order to just make enormous amounts of money. It doesn't matter if they're communists. It doesn't matter if they're, apartheid South Africa. Nothing matters to them other than making money. So to the point where in Tunisia, when the Arab Spring happened, part of that, and they'll deny it to this day, they were able to manipulate commodity prices for wheat so much that when the governments over there, most people couldn't afford to eat anymore. And so you have the Arab rising that happened in the Middle East because they're so heavily dependent on Russian, Ukrainian, and U.S. wheat that when the prices rose, wheat in essence got revolutions. And they're always able to wipe their hands of it. They're just looking at numbers, or any number of different things. So you get that sort of total manipulation of the system that bankrupts farms, that bankrupts entire economies, and these guys just sit back and just make tens and tens of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars.
Unbelievable amounts of money.
Yeah, and Cargill has I think 14 billionaires in their family alone, and there's still a very secretive industry that the U.S. government has absolutely no impetus to go after them or to see what's going on there. And Glencore is one of the biggest. They are constantly paying out fines for any number of different things. Or They have been involved in genocides. They've been involved in the killing of in numerous indigenous groups all over the world. They're always just one or two steps away. They pollute entire environments. And what they'll do is they'll make billions of dollars and then have to pay a fine of like maybe $187 million. And they get away with all of it.
Pocket change.
Yeah. So in order to understand the sort of Nixon, Earl, Rusty Butts, I think you have to understand what happened to the commodities market. So what ended up happening is the U.S. taxpayer and the farmers, in essence, built, they really did like operate at scale, to feed enormous parts of the world, but under the yoke of these guys who were just going to make enormous amounts of money off of it. And the more that the bankruptcies started to happen, the more the financialization of that system, you start to get in 2008, you start to get all of these guys starting to move into farmland all over the world. And so what we're seeing now since 2008 is the financialization of farms all over the world. And if they're willing to go into South Sudan, but they're also willing to go into Iowa, Kentucky, any place they can get their hands on. And what happens to farmers is that you can't compete for the price per acreage that these guys can, right? And they can take over your farm if you fall into arrears. They'll lend it to you, right? Right?
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's turning us into, it's turning farmers into renters. It's not dissimilar from having firms like BlackRock buy up all of the housing in cities and creating generations of renters. We're turning farmers into renters. I want to kind of go through this and kind of connect all the dots, because we kind of started with this idea of sterilization and this human desire, born from a couple of different things at the time, to have this sort of sterile white lab, white kitchen, opens a plastic container full of, maybe it's cornflakes, maybe it's something else, that is really coming from this divorce from the country, this moving people into cities forcibly. And then we have the, Wiley and the Pure Food Act that was much needed, and his Poison Squad, and this opportunity 100 years ago to build a really incredible food system that was kind of missed, leading us through. And there's a lot of connecting pieces here into this Great Grain Robbery, which I was not familiar with, and that was fascinating. That kind of takes us, dovetails into Earl Butts and Get Big or Get Out, and into 2008, where all of a sudden we're buying up all of this farmland and commoditizing it. The financialization of farms is what you said. And so we're 100 years from where we could have had a really fantastic food system out thereabouts.
Yeah, totally.
So we're about a century into this mess. A lot has happened. And, some of what you're explaining is the sort of globalization of food as well,
right.
Of how this has gotten so far from our backyards, and not just of food, but you mentioned precious metals too, things like cobalt that is in all of our electronics and everything, and this outsourcing of all of these things we need for modern life. And so I just want to put us there in that space, because I think that this is important for building that world viewpoint, but also for building that, where are we operating from? How do we form all of these opinions?
Yeah, and I do think it's very difficult. Like, I think if we can say that the 100 years ago that happened is so similar, almost a mirror image, to what is happening today. What we have is more technology. I can talk to you. Back then, maybe you had the telephone. The radio was the premier technology. So now I can sort of, my mind can fill the space of an Iowa farmer or somebody in England. And so you had this whole new technology that governments were leveraging in order to sort of create like a sense of a community within people who were generally kind of left alone, right? And then you start to see The scramble for Africa was in 1870, all the way up into the early part of the 20th century. Most of that was for resources. We see that happening today in Africa as well, especially the Congo. And then we say it's to decarbonize our entire system. Like I don't even want to get into that. But we create a crisis. The crisis creates, Germany. Hitler talked a lot about Lebensraum, which is a term that means, in essence, sort of like a place for Germany for farming. And so you talk about this idea of, the sort of control of the narrative around a crisis. And then you create a crisis that becomes the overarching thing that everybody is really focused on. And now we have every excuse to do whatever we want because it's a crisis. And so what I think we've seen in many different ways is the tech industry has been able to manipulate us in so many different ways in order to get us to sort of like to control the narrative around that, to make sure that the normal consumer is so fucking confused, like is hit on a 24-hour news cycle, 365 days of the year with like the newest thing, whatever the new crisis is. And we're able to leverage a lot of this stuff because we say we're doing an inherent good. So you get somebody like, I don't know if you know anything about King Leopold. King Leopold, in essence, he was the king of Belgium, but he was a single individual who owned the Congo. Like Belgium didn't even own it. He bought it. And his whole idea was to create civilization for Africa. And so he sold it as kind of a nonprofit, right? And so... Great. Right? And so he goes, right. And it to this day, again, we'll never know how many people died, between 4 and 6 million people. There was enormous amounts of terrorism involved in it. It was to excise all of the resources out of the Congo that could possibly be done at the time. And for him, it was rubber. He was obsessed with rubber. It was a machinery tool and just absolutely important. Unilever was another company, Lord Levershulme. We all know them. But he, England wouldn't give him the space in order to operate his palm oil factories. So he went to the King of Belgium, and the King of Belgium gave him all of that stuff. So in order to, again, to go back to cleanliness, in order to wipe the asses of English people and keep them clean, because he made soap, right? He, in essence, created a genocide in the Congo. But these were all what he did. The narrative at the time always is to civilize people, to bring commerce and Christianity and civilization to the peoples of the world. And we see this over and over again. It's playing out in the beginning of the 21st century as well. We see the way that we have marketed the idea of, Elon Musk says we will conquer whoever we want in order to decarbonize this. So I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a 30,000 foot view on this, because I think it's kind of an interesting aspect of some of the aspects of this is they have a viewpoint. They have an idea, right? This idea is, it's sort of a race against time. The way that I try to construct it in my head, we're driving towards this cliff, right? Does civilization make it? Are we going to be able to put the brakes on all of the biodiversity laws? Are we going to create this unique society where you get, this perfectly designed Tesla that's just so beautiful? So you create this thing, and you create this idea that what you are building is a civilizational structure that will expand our consciousness to the universe. So Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, when he gave up his company to Elon Musk, that's what he said. That was one of his last tweets was, I'm giving this to Elon to expand our consciousness to the universe. And so they have this idea of this sort of civilizational plan where they can take their little, penis rockets and shoot them out into space, and these billionaires are building this whole thing. We're not even part of this conversation. No. Do we want to build a society that has, provides ecosystem function, that builds diversity, that has soil that you can grow, that builds fertility, that tries not to escape death because these guys are obsessed with this, right? They're obsessed with living 150 years because we have to have them around for another 150 years, right? And so what they build is, so what we built is this it's a religious cult. The way I tried to describe it is they built a religious cult that says, actually, we don't matter anymore because when you look at the mathematics of it, our individual lives do not matter as much as the trillions of people who will live in the future. And so when you look at the math, your life is worthless. All you are is some sort of pod to get them to that space. And so they built into this thing, this term called long-termism, which is sort of centered around this idea of like, while you'll see Elon Musk say we need more children, we need to build more populations and all of this other stuff. So they built this entire framework of this world that is driving us to this civilizational structure that they don't know what it looks like. Maybe it involves AI. Maybe we digitize ourselves. And then we have like you and I, who I think agrees, like it just sounds like the worst thing. You're trapped in this matrix forever.
Yes.
You know,
and
never touch anything.
Everything is sterile, and technology is the answer to everything. It's just technology has an answer. We'll just form an answer with technology, and we'll just become continually more divorced from anything that gave birth to the human organism.
Yeah. Like when I used to teach in schools, we were working with like kindergarten to fourth grade, right? The thing that I did for the most part over the course of that time was get these kids familiar with growing things, to get their hands in the dirt. And it was like every single time, it'd be like, all right, we're going to go grow something. And they'd be like, all right, take out the Purell. Like they would Purell these kids every single time. I'm like, please stop.
Please just leave the
dirt isn't dirty.
Yeah, that's honestly what they need. But they're dirt deficient. Right. They're not Purell deficient.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, and like, I don't know. So I know we're going in many different tangents, and I don't want to lose the audience in many different ways. Because I like in some ways I'd need to have these conversations every once in a while because I feel like, you know, they're important to have with people who are like, you know, like say Brett is like going into this because he's had this like unique experience of a health journey, but now he's like he's I listened to the podcast recently, but he's using this as to build a worldview that is like fundamentally nourishing people and the planet. So I want to talk to those guys who like these you know people in their 20s who are being told like, listen, the future is so nebulous. Like you're going to train for jobs at a college that probably won't exist in 4 years. You know, like you're going to do all of these things. Like I have kids, my son just went to college, but you're training for these things that probably won't exist, that the world is moving so quickly that it doesn't even matter anymore what you're studying, what your major is or anything like that. And I'm like, wait a second. There are a whole generation of kids who don't like school, don't want to sit in the classroom, don't want to sit in a fucking cubicle, right? Like crunching numbers all day. Like let's give them a path forward so that they can say, all right, well, I want to be outside, you know, I want to grow things. I want to like, you know, let's talk to them, you know, fuck the rest of them. They were just like, you know, building their worldview where they're like stuck in the matrix and they upload their consciousness. I'm like, God, that sounds awful. You know?
Sounds horrible. It sounds like my worst nightmare. But it's really important to understand how we got to that viewpoint. And I'm really grateful to the way that you just unpacked, you know, the small pieces of it. I mean, we could spend days unpacking how we got to that. But helping to understand that there is this drive towards civilization, big quotes on civilization, and sterility and this idea of a deathless space and how much tunnel vision that's given us. In a lot of ways, I feel like we're in a tunnel, we're only looking at those things, and we're being offered as solutions ever-growing bits of technology. Well, you know, if this is an issue, then we'll just insert this technology here. And if this comes, you know, if the sun is too much, then we'll just blanket the sun with something.
Yes.
If there's too much carbon, we'll just put these crystals in the dirt that absorb carbon, and they're very singular. They're very cold. They're very singular. They don't consider what a holistic system is. They're very based, on sort of statistical analyses that can't consider the complexity of an ecosystem, much less the complexities of the humans that are a part of that ecosystem.
Yeah, and one of my favorite writers is a guy by the name of Trevanian. He wrote a book in like 1979. It's called Shibumi. And one of the things he kind of makes a point in this, so this is the dawn of the computer age. And he said that something to the effect of, we thought the world would end in chaos. But what we're finding is that it's actually going to end in like a total objectification of the world, like a statistical analysis of everything. That we're going to, like take everything and just take it down to these fundamental parts, break it apart, right? And I just find it so important. Like, I remember Paige Stanley, who is sort of an advocate of regenerative agriculture. She's a scientist. She works primarily in studying a lot of carbon, methane in cows and any number of things. She's overall just a great person. But she talks about the fundamental difficulty of like studying regenerative agriculture because it's ecosystem dependent, right? If you are in the Southwest and you're a rancher, you have completely different, problems and opportunities and, than somebody in the Northeast or in Mexico or in Guatemala or anything like that. Every single one of them is going to be different. You cannot just measure methane and say, all right, well, the easiest thing to do is just, in essence, like, just get rid of it. It's deforestation for cattle production. Well, what about cocaine production? There's a ton of deforestation for cocaine production, right? It's plant-based. It's plant-based, But same thing. It's the second leading cause of deforestation is palm oil, right? And most of that is going into processed foods, right? So when you take out the nutrient quality of foods and don't even factor that in, then you can say palm oil is not in anywhere near cattle production. And we can go into all of the details of that. It's so hard to kind of get into every aspect of it, but it does seem to be the talking point that kind of comes up more often than not, deforestation. But like, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, because one of the things that you said in a previous interview that really struck me is here we're talking about this sort of tunnel vision around civilization and these sterile environments and technology. Then we have this tunnel vision of, what this catastrophe is, this looming catastrophe. And it's really centered down on meat and on carbon and on all of these different things that I think the majority of us are familiar with. But you brought up something that I thought was really interesting, and we're not seeking the environmental footprint of, say, the defense industry or the pharmaceutical industry, right? Or the cocaine industry, right? Like
hard to measure. Hard to measure the cocaine industry.
Incredibly hard to measure. And so it's kind of interesting to me that we've just really chosen to focus the majority of our attention, not all of our attention, but the majority of our attention here, when there are all of these other industries that require a lot of inputs to get where they're going and are pulling resources predominantly from spaces like the Congo and spaces that are not in our backyards, right? There's a whole, and just how that tunnel vision has kind of happened. But we can also unpack deforestation and palm oil. But I think that it's really interesting to bring that up because there are all of these different industries that have inputs that aren't really being looked at or considered much.
Yeah, and it really does come down to what you're measuring. So, and you can see the breaking point for that, right? I don't think anybody would ever talk about methane or acreage for production or anything like that until Cowspiracy. And so you had this enormously popular documentary come out by two grown idiots. You know, I'm going to get in my trusty old blue bell and drive around, and I'm going to type in some stuff on a computer and discover the truth. I mean, real, like, ethical vegans just living an ethical vegan life. Like, none of that stuff was ever true. They're not seekers. They have a very specific point of view. They are financed and paid off for by people who donate most of their time to Mercy for Animals. Jim Greenbaum, you'll find on as a producer on most vegan documentaries. He made somewhere around $300 million in the telecom industry, and he's devoted his entire life to ending animal agriculture. And so you'll find him on the IMDb producer credits for almost every vegan documentary that comes out. So these guys are heavily dependent upon one thing. They're sort of semi-religious institution that is focused on one thing and one thing alone. And so there's wonderful podcast if you ever get a chance to. It's called Climate One, and it's a debate between Nicolette Nyman and one of the producers. Oh my God, it's so much fun to listen to. But go all the way through it and get to the end, to the Q&A, and there are people standing in the audience who were interviewed for Cowspiracy who were like, you directly manipulated, one, why you were there, and which is allowable, I think, within documentaries. Maybe you can lie, as to your intentions, but also you manipulated what I said in order to make it sound like I was saying something completely different. And so, for us in Sacred Cow, we actually released all of our interviews. You can listen to them. You can go on the website. You can listen to the totality of it. You can listen to the point of view. And look, it was our point of view. We went to find people who, were going to dive into different issues in a very different way from what you were getting from a lot of these other documentaries. But we did release them so that, like, you can actually delve into it. You want to find out what this person said before and after that conversation? Here you go. And we're doing it again with Death in the Garden. We're releasing everything as a podcast. If we're interviewing somebody for this film, you can listen to the totality of it. And we do have a very specific point of view. We want to build a landscape for the future that looks very different from this tech industry sort of,
Techno-Utopia.
Yeah, and so I think for us, it's like... It always is an interesting conversation. Cattle are a strange phenomenon because they've been placeholders ever since, all the way back to medieval times. It was a form of currency. Livestock have always been a form of currency in many different ways. And so it becomes sort of something that you can kind of beat up on because you can look at what people eat and you can make a value judgment over that. And it is one of the weirder parts of most sort of religious institutions is that they do have times and periods when you're supposed to not eat, times and periods when you're not supposed to eat meat, times and periods when you're supposed to sort of cleanse your soul and cleanse your body by not allowing death to enter into your body. And so you see this sort of pseudo-religious, institutionalized sort of aspect to the world that kind of happens within the vegan community that seeks a higher form of enlightenment that says, listen, we have transcended death on this planet because now we only eat the sort of plant-based materials. And so all we're trying to do is sort of bring balance to the equation. Like you have a choice as an adult. You have a choice over what you can eat. You should make an informed choice. Nutrients and protein and any number of different things, you should make an informed choice. But when they started to get into school food and they started to push for vegan Fridays in New York City, and started to push for meatless Mondays, and all of that stuff, I said, that is it. And you can see there's a direct link between my advocacy to the point where they started to institute this in places that I had been working for close to a decade. So I'd been working in inner city schools, working primarily with kids from we were pre-kindergarten to fifth grade. This was the point where you can introduce them to novel foods, and you can teach them where their food is coming from. And it was all in-house classes and, fun stuff. And the kids were breaking down vegetables and trying new things and any number of different things. We were working with 1,500 kids a week. We were teaching 18 schools. We were working with them over the course of 2 years. We worked with Michelle Obama's Let's Move program. I shat all over that. I think it was a mess. It was just a giveaway to the processed food industry, asking them to just please stop advertising to children. They were like, no. And you were like, okay. No political pressure at all.
There was none. There was zero.
Zero political pressure for these guys to do anything. And all they have done is double down on it, right? They want your children so badly. They want to create consumers for life. Yes. They want to do the same thing the cigarette industry did. Was if you start smoking Marlboro when you're 16 years old, you are a Marlboro customer for life. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, any number of these different institutions work this way. And so when I was working with these schools and I started to move up that ladder and start to move with the larger institutions, none of these people cared, right? So education doesn't care about food. And they consider the two just to be completely polar opposite things. And I'm I can't, I don't know how to sit down with you long enough to make you see how important food is to that child, to that child's ability to pay attention, to that child's ability to function.
Everything,
yes. In a space where they're denied sunlight, they're denied physical education. Mm-hmm. They're denied a place in society because they're holed yes. up for 18 years of their life in a freaking cubicle. And so they're completely removed from all the aspect of say an adult society. And then they'll question. So Brett was saying this, he was like, you go to college and you go hog wild. Why do you go hog wild? Because you've never had any ounce of freedom up until that point.
Never had any autonomy.
Yeah. And what schools are doing now is even worse. When I was in school, I was a shitty student. I was totally terrible. But at least I had the ability to draw and spend time in my own mind and look out the window and see stuff. Now, if you fall behind in one test, you get an email. Your parents are on you. The school is on you. It's a total surveillance state. These kids are not allowed to.
They're starting to track attention too. They're starting in China. They're starting to actually track attention, and so it then notifies the teacher that this student has stopped paying attention, so that they can be re-engaged by whatever method. I'm not sure what that is. Yeah, I mean, we
shame, really. It's got to be shame, right? You call them out in front of class. You say you're not paying attention.
Yeah, and I think in many ways that this method of education is an experiment. I mean, this is not the place that children have held in society for many years, and there's a lot that can be learned outside. And I think I heard you say this on another podcast. You don't need to teach the days of the week and the seasons. They just, they happen, and you learn about how they happen. You don't need a laminated card that says fall with a red leaf. Yeah. It's going to come around once a year and become a part of your understanding of the world.
Yeah. And if you do want to dive into it, I think it's incumbent upon adults more than children to read about the history of compulsory education. And one of the harder parts, I think, for a lot of adults is to realize that you've been through a program that actually really didn't educate you. And you should spend your time actually taking apart that thing, because you've been in essence shuttled into something for a very long time. You were told you're only good at this. And it's totally absurd. The human experience of learning does not involve 45 minutes of being a poet and 45 minutes of being a mathematician. Right? It involves having a question about, maybe, I don't know. It seemed absurd to me when I was going through it. I'm like, I'm a poet now? And so you have to understand that when this was being built, it was built for a very specific purpose. It was during the Industrial Revolution, and they said, well, "What we want to do," and this is almost a direct quote from Woodrow Wilson. "We want to create a class of people that learn a liberal education, that grow up learning dialectic and understanding, and however the human experience of learning is." And that class will rule over the other class, which will learn, in essence, like just how to be, a product, a consumer, right? Sorry, I butchered that quote. We'll find it later. But we created two classes of people, and that sort of aspect of our world actually govern compulsory education. And the primary financiers of this were the billionaire class of the time, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and stuff like that. And when they tell you exactly what they're doing, then believe them, right? And so. Yeah. Yeah. And so it's a very different educational system from what you see in a lot of sort of the elite schools. Elite schools are, they'll have the way that John Taylor Gatto, who actually did some of the primary research on a lot of this stuff, he was a New York City Teacher of the Year, New York State Teacher of the Year, and he quit. He said, "I can no longer abuse these children in the way that you're telling me to." But the kids absolutely loved him. And he wrote a number of different books. But one is sort of an underground history of education in the United States. It's just a really interesting sort of like, he kind of goes through any number of different steps that were involved in the creation of the educational system that we have. And they knew at the time that they were going to create the, he talks about something called the B-STEP. It's called the Behavioral Sciences Teacher Education Program that came out in the late 60s. And this was the sort of dawn of the pharmaceutical age, where we were starting to get a lot of antidepressants and antipsychotics and therapeutics and stuff like that to kind of like dull and narcotize people. And they realized that what they were creating was a model of education that was actually destroying children. And so they actually advocated for the introduction of a lot of these medications to children. And so they knew as far back as the late 60s that they were creating the level of tension and violence that we were seeing in the 60s and 70s in schools. And so when I was teaching, we were teaching in some of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. A lot of the kids were in foster care. We worked with kids who were on the autistic spectrum. We went into some of the hardest hit schools in the inner city, and we're primarily working with them to overhaul school food. But what we found was so many of those kids were just so over narcotized. There were so many medications to get them through the day, and you could see this, like it was just so hard to watch. And the pharmaceutical agencies have been able to just completely change our worldview on what we consider to be childhood, right? Like, what is a child? Yeah.
Kind of on this educational track. Do we want to kind of go and unpack the pharmaceutical and the medicalization of the human experience? Do we kind of want to begin to unpack that?
Yeah, but I feel like I'm talking too much. Why don't you tell me like your sense of it? Because I'm so in it and I'm so passionate about it, but like I want to hear somebody else's point of view on it. Even like personal experience.
In terms of education specifically, or in
education,
terms of all of this?
In terms of your understanding of like the way we've medicalized normal human impulses, grief, sadness,
Yeah. I mean, I think this is all part and parcel, and I think that's what is most interesting about this conversation. And you have brought in a lot of things that I wasn't aware of. I don't want to say this, but it's not often that I get caught a little unaware and like, oh, I have more reading to do, and this conversation has caught me in that space as a consummate reader. I think that something really interesting begins to happen when you unpack the food system, and that is that it seems to be a doorway for ways in which, and this is to say, maybe you feel lied to, or the ways in which you've been manipulated, or the ways in which we as society have been sort of institutionalized within a paradigm. And once you kind of start peeling that back and you're like, oh, saturated fat doesn't do this, and there's this whole Ansel Keys thing, and there's all these different pieces, then it kind of gives you this set of glasses that you can put on and look through them and be like, oh, what else in my world might be like that? And all of a sudden you begin to sort of look at, say, school systems and the way that school systems have been brought up over the last 100 or so years. Or you put them on and you look at them, the medicalization of the human experience. And you start to see these threads that are woven together, and that they're fraying and falling apart, right? Like you look at it and you're like, oh, it's just a beautiful braid. Everything is rosy. You put the glasses on, you're like, oh, this entire thing is like fraying and rosy, right, falling apart. And I think that some of this is informed by personal experience and the lens that we look back on it on. And I think for many of us as students, maybe that failed to fit into the mold of the way that we educate, have always had a little bit of a rebellious perspective on school systems, and I'm certainly one of them. But I think unpacking the medicalization of the human experience, because I think in many ways it is parallel to what we've been talking about, in that Here on this techno-utopian side, we have a space where there's a technological pill to cure everything without ever looking at the root cause. We don't need to know. Really. We'll just give it a little technological pill. If it's cows, we won't look for the root cause. We'll just slap a Beyond Burger on it. We won't unpack everything that Beyond Burger is doing. And I think that it's the same with the human experience, and what this conversation has been is leading into the ways in which we've been misled and, to a degree manipulated and herded into these little boxes. And I certainly, and we talked about this a little bit on a backstory, had this experience where by the age of 15, I had probably been on 11 or 12 different pharmaceutical drugs in order to shift my human experience, because, and there were a number of factors here, but I think when we begin to unpack the mental health history, and I think we should do that. I did a very deep dive into this prior to this interview, but I had this experience where all of a sudden, as a little kid who was experiencing a lot of trauma at home, who deeply did not fit in at school and was just lost on how to socialize with other children, was, at times in early years, nonverbal in school, had this experience where all of a sudden I was being put on medication after medication, trying to get me to fit into this mold, trying to take what was viewed as the edges off of this little kid, and without looking at my environment or the ways in which life might not have been very comfortable for me. And some of the things that I was expressing were a part of that deep discomfort of what was happening at home, and the fact that school was no safer than home was. And I think that we're seeing this across the board, and I think I was amongst that first generation. This is happening, around the mid 90s to the late 90s for me. The first generation, maybe not. You're talking about this really happening in the 60s, but I was one of the only kids I knew that was on all of these different antidepressants, antipsychotics, none of which were working, and given all of these labels for my mental health. And so for this interview, and as something I've been doing on the side anyway, is unpacking this entire history of how we pathologize what it is to be human. And I think it's so fascinating that we have these labels that we fit on the human experience. And we can talk about some of why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'll tell you a personal story that deeply affected me. So, let's see, where to sort of begin on this. This is 2001, and my family situation. My mother and father should not have been together. Let's just say that. Completely different people.
Similar upbringing.
As they grew up together, they grew apart from each other, and my father was incredibly abusive, just verbally abusive. But my mom had been with him for close to 35 years, and in 2001, I came home. And I found her in the bathroom, and she was incoherent and not making sense. She just went to go throw up, and she wanted to go lay back down again. And I went and I said, no, we're going to go to the hospital. And so I took her to the hospital, and they couldn't figure out what was going on with her. I went to her bedroom that night, and I discovered a suicide note. And I totally understood where she was coming from on it. I totally understood that she'd felt trapped in this marriage, and completely just no way out of it. And I blame myself for not telling her to just fucking go. And she wanted to go back afterwards, and we just, as a family, we just wouldn't allow it. And so this is about. I think it was about 2 months after I met my future wife. And so we had just met each other, and I was like, I think we're going to break up because it's just like, I'm just dealing with like all of this stuff right now. And she was like, fuck this. Like, I'm staying with you, and we're just going to figure this out. And so she helped me through all of this. It was the worst moment in my entire life. Helping my mom recover, helping her understand that she was a victim of abuse was so hard. And so we're going into, I was supposed to go to Florence to study art, and I'd gotten accepted to this elite program. And on September 11th, my future wife's company worked in World Trade Center 1. And through just a number of different events, she just wasn't there that day. They had a meeting that was canceled the day before because they had let 2 people go. And so she would have been there that day. And on September 11th, I moved in with her. And, we just went through all of it. Like, Cantor Fitzgerald was one of the companies that was worst hit. It was on the top of the World Trade Center. Most of the people were already there. They lost like over 750 people that day. We went through all of the trauma of that. So a global trauma and then individual healing. And I went to the doctor, and I was like, just dealing with all of this stuff. Like, New York City was burning. And she's like, I think you have depression. I'm like, so she's like, here, take a pill. No, it's totally absurd.
No shit.
And she's like, here, take a pill. Like, you must have like a, like let's ignore the environment. Ignore everything that just happened to me. You must have a chemical imbalance. And for the next 2 years, I'm on this pill. And the thing that got me off of it, the thing that actually got me off of it was I was sitting down with my son. We're married. My son was 6 months old, and he smiled for the first time. And I felt nothing. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I felt nothing. And I was like, I gotta stop. Like, this stuff is just awful. It takes away every edge of life, And so for me, like, the journey was like, all right, well, wean myself off of this. Maybe it was environment. Maybe it was things that happened in my life. And like, in some ways I understand. Like, first of all, she wasn't a psychiatrist. She was just my local doctor.
She was your
she
GP.
shouldn't have been prescribing. Yeah, she shouldn't have been prescribing anything. And so I started to look into it, and I'll kind of tell a story it's an interesting story. So, and this again happened in the 70s. Like, whatever the fuck was going on in the 70s, like, Jesus Christ. Yeah.
This really starts in the 70s. Yeah, right. I have.
And Yeah.
Of
And so
course.
this is the heyday. This is sort of the heyday of psychiatry because up until this point, they are gods among men, right? So they are like, if you want to watch there's a documentary about these three triplets who were separated at birth by the psychologist who wanted to study the differences between one raised in a wealthy family and middle-class family and a poor family. And so they separated these three kids and just went in every couple months and like checked off how the children were doing and any number of different things. Like the level to which psychology dominated our worldview all the way through the 20s into the 60s and 70s was so strong. So you get this professor. It's called the Thud experiment. And so he goes and he takes, I forgot what it was, like maybe 8 or 9 students. And he takes them to all these institutions all over the United States. They travel there and they go in and they say, I'm starting to hear voices. They all say exactly the same thing. Otherwise, they're completely normal. But they say, I'm starting to hear this voice. And this voice in my head says one word, thud. And that's it. And every single institution goes, plus the professor, every single institution goes and admits them, diagnoses them and admits them, starts to give them like narcotizing drugs and any number of different things. And just based on that, the thud experiment, they just said the word thud, right? So then you know, like they all tell their family they'll be back in a couple days. They're there for weeks. Right? The professor is there for weeks. He's like, listen, this was an experiment and I just wanted to find out like how easy it was to get diagnosed. And they're like, ha ha ha, you can't fool us. You've been diagnosed. And so they're like, we can't be fooled. And so he can't get out. Right? And so the only way that they're able to find to get out is to admit that they're insane and then to start to get better so that the psychologists believe that they're curing them. And so eventually they get out and it becomes a huge scandal in the psychology community, right? So one hospital this one hospital goes to them and is like, they're like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe that happened once. But like now we're primed. There's no way you're going to be able to fool us. And they're like, send some more people and they'll never, you know, like whatever. And so he's like, yeah, all right. So I sent a bunch of students. And so they go, well, all right. So we discovered it. We released 41 people that were all your students. And now, you know, we discovered who they were. And he was like, I didn't actually send anybody.
Too good.
Yeah. And so this is a huge crisis within the community. So not only can they not diagnose, but from hospital to hospital, they're also getting diagnosed in different ways. So there's no standardized level of care. And they want to be treated like physics and chemistry. They want to be treated like a science. And they are saying for the last 30 years that they are a science. And this guy devised an entire program and just completely wipes them. And so they decide to come up with the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness. And it's just any number of different maladies. Like we've all grown up with them, obsessive compulsive disorder, agoraphobia, any number of different things. There were, I think, somewhere between 12 and 14, all men, all like top of their field, who sat down in a room and just like spitballed malady after malady and just threw it out into the world. Go ahead.
Based on what they were experiencing and what they were studying or excited about within their practices.
Yeah. And so they would say, oh, well, you know, say like something like constantly chewing a pencil or something like that. And one of the psychologists would be like, wait a second, I do that. That can't be in there. So like, it's just a free for all, right? Yes. And they released the DSM. And the DSM, in essence, sort of creates the modern culture of our world. It becomes part of modern, Hollywood culture, sitcoms. Everybody's self-diagnosing. In essence, they create a world where it actually becomes kind of funny because now you have people going into psychologist's office and saying, I have obsessive compulsive disorder. Can you diagnose me? And so what Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add to this just a little bit?
Yeah,
because
go for it.
I think that how they create the world is really important. And so you have these diagnoses that have been based on these checklists. They're not based on objective data. I mean, it's purely subjective what people are experiencing. There's no way to really look at this. And I have quotes from several people that were on the DSM-3 task force when things really start to change in the 70s that basically say that they were just making stuff up. But I think this is really important, is that marketing comes into this, that they're trying to figure out how to market drugs. And this really happened in the Thorazine situation in the 60s, that Thorazine comes online, they look for a Thorazine light, and all of these different sedative drugs that allow people to function but take these edges off of society come out. And the DSM allows them not to market a drug. And Arthur Sackler gets involved in this, who was a big physician that became a part of this marketing engine for the drug industry. But they start marketing these diagnoses, not the drugs. So we're not marketing, say, Prozac. We're marketing, well, are you experiencing, low energy and bouts of sadness and all of these different things? Oh, we have a solution for that. And I think that this is really novel, because what you're doing is you're inviting people into this space to say, oh, well, I have that.
Right.
You're not marketing Prozac, you're marketing depression as part of this lexicon. And then you're saying, oh, we have a quote unquote cure for what you have.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add
Yeah.
that.
And again, I want to reiterate, it is the medicalization of normal human experiences. What I was experiencing was deep grief, but that can't happen. And so the DSM used to have, for depression, it used to have a clause for grief, and
Bereavement.
Bereavement, right?
They call it the bereavement exception.
Yeah. And I think originally it started out it was about a year, right? So if you had a traumatic event happen in your life, the chemical imbalance theory started to kind of take over, and there was a sort of a war between the two. Can an experience happen in your life that would cause, depression for a long period of time? Or do you actually have a chemical imbalance? And it was a war between the two. Eventually, it kind of sort of got whittled down to about 2 weeks. Right? So,
Yes.
if your family member passes away, you got 2 weeks to get over that shit.
2 weeks. Yeah. 2 weeks. And then in this latest version of the DSM, and it's like the DSM-5 TR, I don't know what it is, they took it away.
Yeah. They took it away because they couldn't reconcile the problem with it too. So if you feel, and look, if you're involved in health awareness, you know how important sleep is. There is something called the Hamilton scale that looks at any number of different, I think it's like 51 things on there that you sort of fill out that are supposed to be sort of associated with depression. And one of them, lack of sleep, if you actually can work out that sleep problem, the points that will go up is somewhere around 6. You can fundamentally change by proper eating, exercise, any number of different things, actually do better on the Hamilton scale than SSRIs. And so there was Irving Kirsch in the 90s. I don't know if you've ever heard about him. He's a really funny, interesting guy. So he goes, he's working with, one of his students is working on the idea of the placebo effect, right? He's really, really interested in the placebo effect. And so Kirsch actually starts to work with him. I want to say his name is Sonnenheim, but they start working together, and they're trying to sort of figure out, with SSRIs, what is the percentage of gain on this scale that happens over a period of time? And they're looking at all these meta-analyses and that are produced by the pharmaceutical industries talking about the effectiveness of SSRIs. And so he puts out the meta-analysis. They check these numbers. They're like, these numbers can't be right. They check them, they recheck them, and then finally they publish them. And they come out and they're like, my God, this stuff is barely effective over a placebo. Right? And so you have multiple things that are happening at this time. One, depression doesn't last forever. So even if you're, unless you're, the lead singer of The Cure, because that guy says he's been depressed for 30 years.
I don't think he's sleeping.
And he's
it's all
vegan.
the deforestation that's happening of the cocaine, I think.
Right. So you're going to get better over time anyway. So if you're taking the medication or taking a placebo, you're probably the overall period of time that you're going to start to feel a little bit better. The distinction, the differences between the SSRIs are so small. It's unintelligible. And so he publishes, caused a huge furor, and everybody kind of comes out and the blowback from it was like, well, they said, well, actually, you didn't study all of the studies that weren't published. He's like, what do you mean? There's studies that weren't published? He said, yeah, the pharmaceutical industries don't publish the studies that don't really show anything. And so he goes Freedom of Information Act. He gets those studies and he's like, oh my God, this stuff doesn't work at all. Right? The only reason it works is because you experience side effects. Right? So because you're experiencing a side effect, you assume the thing is working. And it's still to this day, it's like, and you can look online, people sort of like, I'm sure there's industry published literature saying that his analysis was incorrect or anything like that. But, it should have fundamentally changed the entire sector altogether.
Yes.
But we have, $14 billion a year made on SSRIs. We have $18 billion a year on antipsychotic medication. And so these industries have functionally shifted the way that we think about psychology altogether. This is all chemical imbalance. And the way that they have been able to sort of work so that now you can functionally change a lot of this stuff that you can now put kids on them. So we've medicalized childhood, right? We medicalized boys. We medicalized their inability to sit in a classroom. Most of the kids that I was teaching in inner city schools were being dropped off at between 7 and 8 a.m. and they were getting picked up at 6 p.m. at night. And they were living their lives inside of a school. And these were schools that were really trying. I mean, they had after school programs. Not all of it was dedicated to STEM. There was a lot of stuff. They were getting the kids outside no matter what day of even if it was like lightly raining out, these kids were going outside as much as you possibly could. But these kids were spending that much time away from family, and spending functionally most of their life, administered by these schools. And so this was like, you can't operate this way. You can't think this way. You can't, educate this way.
No, this is not the environment for a child at all.
Yeah.
And I think, ADHD increased, right? The rate of diagnosis of ADHD increased 41% between 2003 and 2012. And I think that when you look at it, and I have all of these statistics over here, but when you look at this, I think what you see is, especially with the medicalization of children, like children were not supposed to sit in a desk for hours at a time, being a poet 1 minute and a mathematician the next. Mm-hmm. That is not something that is part of that childhood experience. And again, you've cleaved them. What you said really struck me, that you've cleaved them from culture, from adult, from that space. You've isolated them. You've siloed them in this strange situation, and taken away a lot of the physical education that at least used to be somewhat a part of it. And of course, these kids are not able to pay attention and are hyper. And I think that, one of the things that I've loved as a tangent is Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men, that looks at the education gap that is happening for boys just in the last 10 to 15 years as boys really start to fall behind in school. And I think that this is one part of that problem.
Yeah, I like, especially during COVID, the notion that children were falling behind was so abhorrent to me. Falling behind what? Like, what?
Yes.
I mean, we
Yeah.
keep on changing this stuff to like, and you talk about it within the health community, the way that a lot of the educational system, like they're looking at grip strength in the 80s and grip strength now, and it's just precipitously, it's just gone down.
Oh yeah.
Kids can't
Yeah.
hang on monkey bars anymore and all of this stuff. And so
Oh.
what did they do? Did they spend more time outside? No, they just lowered the threshold for what they consider to be strong grip strength. you know, so it's just like
Change that. We'll just change
yeah,
that.
and we're
We'll
just
change it so it
playing.
fits.
Yeah, totally. And and I think it's just like they're because people will ask me like how do you read 2 or 3 books a week? How do you spend that much time consuming information? How do you remember things? And I said, like, I don't have a theory behind it. I don't like talk about it. I associate the stuff that I do with an emotional experience. So when I remember things, it's because I'm studying something that has an emotional resonance with me. And so because it has an emotional resonance, my brain naturally adheres to it, creates connections. When you are learning stuff that is intrinsically invaluable to you, then you will remember. When you like, I mean, you ask somebody who is obsessed with, say, soccer or football, like the stats and the scores on any number of different teams, like the depth of knowledge is absolutely insane because they want to know. There's no distinction between those two. But the way our educational system works is says, listen, we're going to teach you this thing. It has no value to you right now, but it'll have value to you in the future. And there's no way to think that way for a kid. And so, you're constantly inundated with this thing that's so abstract. The reason why the kids loved our program was because it wasn't abstracted. We weren't showing them pictures of carrots. They were holding carrots in their hand, They were smelling carrots. I mean, we had kids
Touching carrots.
we had kids who only ate white foods, who
Yeah.
like suddenly tried strawberries. I mean, we were working with kids, so 40% of the kids were on the autistic spectrum. They have any number of different sense and tactile issues and stuff like that. And you cannot bypass that by showing them a picture of something on a screen, you know?
It has to
and
have
so-
resonance.
Yeah. And so, like, it drives me batty.
But that is the medicalization of the human experience of this not of our desire for purpose and importance. And I think that this plays into a lot of the diagnoses in adulthood too, right? Like when we are separate from any sort of purpose or feeling like our work is valuable, and that includes being a child, right? And with a worksheet on the seasons. Really stuck on that one.
Yeah, totally.
With a worksheet on the seasons, and well, what is this purpose? And this isn't fulfilling. Like, I am not a member of my community right now. I am not, out exploring and engaging with my curiosity. In fact, maybe my curiosity is punishable or frowned upon within the system that I'm in. I am cleaved from that. And then you look at adults sitting in a cubicle under fluorescent lights with no window, not dissimilar to the spaces that they went to school in as children, and feeling that I don't know, whatever it is that they're doing isn't giving purpose or connection or is part of a community or is rooted in anything of that human experience. And then their reaction to that is, I feel sad, I feel disconnected, I feel depressed, I feel anxious, I feel all of these different things.
Yeah. And the hard part about it for me is that the internalization that there's something wrong with you. Right. And that's where diagnosis comes in. I think for a lot of people who do feel disconnected with, the nature and the reality of the world that they're growing up in, who are traumatized by it. Right. I really believe that there are whole generations of young artists out there who don't get a chance to explore their world in a way that is conducive to an experience, because we're not all the same learners. But we have one track in the way that we think about even just art, You know, there are so many different aspects of that then says that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, right? You know, when you gain weight in an obesogenic environment, well, why can't you exercise enough, right? Well, it turns out Coca-Cola and Pepsi were paying the, you know, International Life Sciences Institute to publish enormous amounts of research into the calories in versus calories out sort of like hypothesis, saying you are lazy, right? Like you should consume less in the most obesogenic environment ever created on this planet, you know?
It just came out that they were also helping fund some of these ventures, that the A&D was helping fund some of them.
You want to hear an insanity, an absolute insanity? 80% of higher functioning animals in zoos are on antidepressants. Like, what the fuck are we doing?
Wow.
Like,
wow.
And they don't even work. Why are we giving it to them? You know?
I mean, it lines somebody's pockets. Jesus. Yeah. I don't even know. Right? But are we just humans in zoos? I can't, other than to say that we are just humans in human zoos experiencing the same disconnection from our nature that those animals are experiencing and reacting to it, and then being told that we're broken and that this is an issue with our brain chemistry, which again, you know, I mean, Nature just published an entire article that was like the serotonin model of depression is not there. We can't find it.
Right. And there are no biological tests for any mental diseases, or maybe Huntington's or something like brain disorders, but not depression or like we have no functionally like objective tests for any of this stuff. This is all just one big theory.
Yeah, all of it. And they talked about that. I mean, there's, you know, here's the guy that was in this DSM-3 task force. What happened is that we made estimates of the prevalence of mental disorders totally descriptively without considering that many of these conditions might be normal reactions, which are not really disorders. That's the problem, because we were not looking at the context in which those conditions developed. Robert Spitzer.
Yeah. Yeah. And
he says it right there.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I do think it was DSM-5 that actually started to introduce a lot of the way that we sort of medicalize childhood experience. So ADHD and what do they call it? Opposition defiance disorder, ODD. You know, so like, all right. So if you studied anything about hunter-gatherer societies, the way that we've spent 99.9% of our existence as, you understand that authority is always questioned, ridiculed, or mocked, because they functionally understand that as soon as somebody stands up and says, "I know better than the rest," the other person is going to like wreck that society. And so if the hunter comes home and he kills an animal, they're like, "My God, it wasn't even worth like walking away from the fire. Look, there's no meat on this, no fat on this animal. What are you doing?" You know, they trade arrows so that if the hunter goes and he kills the animal, was it the hunter or the arrow that was given to him? There's all these different methodologies to ensure that you don't develop an ego that would, in essence, say, like, you, as soon as that ego is developed, then you start to take more wives, you start to take more of your own. And so they set up sort of cultural constructs to ridicule people so that they never feel like they're better than anything else. And so, you know, what we do is we send kids into these environments and we say, "Listen, you see that stranger up there? He's your boss. He's the authority figure. He knows more than you," right? And it's all throughout society, right? Whether it's Elon Musk or Bill Gates or any number of these different people. We say these people are authorities. They are success in one measurement. They're super fucking rich, right? And so therefore they're allowed to tell us everything that we need to know. And if you want to study the absurdities of, say, the Gates, there's a wonderful book that came out years ago. It's called No Such Thing as a Free Gift. and just watch the way this man operates, especially in vaccines and all of this other stuff. The man is he's a joke. He's a joke of an individual. I want to tangent a little bit in this because I want to tell a story about the sort of functional nature of the way that I have to live in these assholes' worlds on a regular basis. So Rockefeller, one of the richest men in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, total robber baron, like just total dominance over everything, so much wealth that we're still dealing with this fucker and all of his children today. Sorry, I'm cursing. You got me. You got me all worked up.
You're fine.
So he owned a mine in Colorado, and it was a company town. And so if you don't know what a company town is centered around this idea that like these workers come in, they have to pay rent. The town is owned by the company, so you pay rent. You pay for all of your supplies, all of the supplies that you're supposed to be using to mine their shit for them, and all of your food. And so you end up in debt. We saw this in Grapes of Wrath with a lot of the agricultural communities in California. But you see this sort of played out, and almost to the point where in certain mining towns, if you were the wife of the man who was in debt, you also had to give yourself over to the management. So this is, the total ownership, with the consent in many ways of the government, the state's governments at the time. And so if you protested, if you showed up and refused to work, or if you actually got violent, the U.S. militia would show up. And this actually happened in Colorado. Rockefeller brought in the U.S. military to what ended up happening was Eugene V. Debs, who was a socialist at the time, I think set up these camps for people to live so that they could protest without actually being in the spaces that were owned by this company town. Sure. And so the U.S. militia showed up and they killed like 51 people, women, children. They just indiscriminately machine gunned these tents. And so up until this point, the newspapers at the time were always pro-business. They were always pro the mining companies because they lived in these large cities, and everything was so dependent upon the energy that was brought in that any disruption in that was abhorrent to the cities. And so the city newspapers would always vilify any workers' protests or anything like that. But this one was horrible. And, seeing women and children dead and all of this other stuff. And so Rockefeller was like, oh, shit, I actually got into trouble. And in some ways, his reputation up until this point was considered in many ways like there were so many drawings of him as sort of an octopus, like controlling, and his tentacles were all over the world and he had too much power. And so he hired a guy by the name of Amos Ames, who was the sort of first guy to kind of create a PR campaign.
Fixer.
The fixer. And they paid him yeah. And so they brought this guy in, and he was going to change the whole sort of landscape of the way that people thought about Rockefeller. And so Rockefeller's son went out to Colorado. They show him with a pick in his hand, and he's like a man's man, whatever. It's a rehabbing of the entire image. Rockefeller starts his foundation. He starts to overhaul school education. He starts to do all of this stuff. He becomes a philanthropic institution that is now considered one of the world's best.
Thread of psychiatry in there. You can unpack some of what he did for, speaking of psychiatry.
Yeah. And it was, so much of it was about spreading a very specific form of, robber baron capitalism to the rest of the world. He was going to civilize the planet. And so the first sort of PR campaign became that. We have completely functionally rehabbed the man's image. Bill Moyers did a thing called The Image Makers, if you want to watch it. It's brilliant. I don't think it's longer than an hour. You can dive into it and see the sort of functional change in that. So why does that matter, right? So you have the Carnegie Endowment, you have Carnegie, you have Rockefeller. Every single one of them got into this, and they became these philanthropic institutions. Flash forward to the early 2000s, you have Gates, who has over all of the 80s and 90s just been a dick just to everyone. right? And so there's an antitrust case that goes up against him. I think it's simultaneously happening in Britain, and it's also happening in the United States. And he's, for the first time in his life, he's actually scared of losing his company. He thinks his company is going to get broken up. And you can see actually the fear in his eyes when you watch some of the trials that were happening at the time. The man is a completely different man than he is today. And so shortly afterwards, he wants to do exactly the same thing. He follows the Rockefeller Foundation. He rehabs his image. What does he do? He says, I'm going to give away 95% of my fortune. I'm going to set up a foundation. I'm going to cure the world. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Has he given away 95% of his fortune? Because the last time I checked, I think the guy was worth what, $200 billion? Buffett gets on board with it. Every single one of these guys, they have completely rehabbed their image. They're now philanthropic institutions that, in essence, sort of govern, and what they can do with a lot of this stuff, and what the Clinton Foundation was able to do was they leverage this idea of child welfare and maternal health and any number of different things to be able to bring themselves into any government on this planet, and then get access to mineral and mining rights, to functionally change the to utilize this wealth and power on the philanthropic front, to be able to create enormous wealth for themselves, and so. And you can see that so the funny story part of it was that Zuckerberg, who's like, I think fucking hated by everyone. Yeah, he tried to do exactly the same thing. Right?
I don't know if he's rehabable.
So he decided, do it. Yeah. So he decided to do the same thing. Zuckerberg Foundation. He gives $100 million to Newark, and nobody fucking cares. And he loses his mind. He throws this huge tantrum. He's like, why can't I do the same thing? And you're like, because nobody likes you, dude.
Nobody likes you.
Yeah. So you have to look at it from the lens of these, the way these people operate, but anyway, so, it's a small tangent, but again, I was, go ahead.
It's an important tangent because I think, we've built this picture, right? Yeah. And at the beginning, we started this talking about how that elite class operates, how they're going to get in their penis rockets and go to Mars and just leave all of us here, and so it's important to understand how they are viewed in society and how that view is shaped. And so I actually don't even think it's tangential. I think that it goes into understanding how in many ways, how we create gods in our society and how they operate within that space and within this deep, deep divide that exists between us and them.
Yeah. So I want to leave you with a story that's or we could just continue. I've just talked about this forever. But I want to talk about effective altruism. I don't know if you've been following any of this. So this is the new scandal. Yeah? Go
into it. All right. I have a little bit of background.
Okay. So... for about a year and a half, I've been looking into this group because there's sort of a weird aspect of this that is sort of followed in the tech community of these people who are really antagonistic to the worldview that the tech community is sort of providing us with. And they have been sort of screaming from the rooftops about a lot of the stuff that's sort of happening within the tech industry in terms of this philosophical perspective that has kind of taken over huge aspects of it. They have sort of this worldview that was starting to govern the way that they were deploying capital. And so if you look back into the origin of it, it was sort of somebody who... while at college at Oxford University, had been studying Peter Singer's work. Peter Singer is a guy in the fucking 70s who wrote a book called Animal Liberation. He's an ethical vegan, and he's really kind of like one of the initial proponents of veganism that got it sort of a world audience in many different ways. So you have the sort of birth of veganism in the sort of 40s and 50s that is sort of marginalized. Nobody really knows what to do with it. Peter Singer comes out, and Peter Singer is a really problematic character. He's not like we can kind of go into some of the aspects of who he is as a person, but he has never been sort of vilified in the way that he should be, because I think because he's considered analytical and divergent thinker, he's allowed to say a lot of really weird and fucking racist shit that he kind of gets away with. But for whatever reason, there is this sort of argument that's sort of put forth in one of his original papers in the 70s. It says something, it's sort of a thought experiment. You get dressed up, you're getting ready to go to work one day, and you're walking past a pond, and there's a child that's drowning in the pond. And so should you ruin your clothing and go to the job interview and get the job, or should you go and save the child? And the way that I always remembered it was, I thought the way he said it was, you go get the job, you make a ton of money, and you give that money away to save more children. But turns out it's not exactly the same. You go, you save the child. So it becomes this sort of like philosophical treatise that says, well, if there is a child anywhere in the world that you can save, you should be using your wealth and privilege to go and save that. And so it comes off as sort of an origin story that sounds really nice, right? Like you should be, right? You should maybe give as a tithe, if you are making $70,000 a year, a certain percentage of your money to help people who are less fortunate. And so that's the beginning of this sort of basic fundamental sort of philosophical premise. And William McCaskill becomes sort of the sort of galvanizing entity behind this, and he finds a number of different people kind of associated with it. He starts to build this movement at Oxford. He's giving away like 70% of everything that he makes, so he's kind of like living really like just as much money as he possibly can. So the movement eventually sort of reaches this weird point where they're like, all right, well, what if we made a ton of money? Right? Like, what if we made shit ton of money? What if we worked for the oil industry or the pharmaceutical industry? What if we worked for the tech industry and we made a ton of money? Then we could give more and more money away. And so it slowly starts to get taken over. And Will's kind of like playing along with it. There's a number, Toby Ord, a number of different people kind of get associated with this, who start to build this movement. And the movement really starts to grow. It's mostly like overeducated, like white, like kids who kind of take over. So let's see if I can go. So I'm going to flash forward a little bit. So by the time that they start to deploy capital in a way that is really relevant, they have, and I think at the height of this, it was somewhere around $40 billion under deployment. And this is coming from two main sources: Sam Bankman-Fried over at FTX, and Dustin Moskowitz and Kari Tuna, who were Facebook founders who are worth billions as well. And both of them consider themselves ethical vegans. The Moskowitzes are huge ethical vegans. They deploy a ton of capital to a number of different causes. Ones that we actually are spending a lot of time actually arguing against a lot. They were the ones who gave a ton of money to The Guardian, millions of dollars to primarily write about animal agriculture through their open philanthropy. Yeah, so their open philanthropy project was funded by the Moskowitzes. Sam Bankman-Fried was giving enormous amounts of money away to vegan causes, media organizations, to the Good Food Institute, which is an offshoot of PETA. One of the guys who had worked at PETA for close to 14 years was one of the big proponents of plant-based meat. They gave millions of dollars to the creation of that, turned him into a quote-unquote scientist. He never studied science. He's just always been an animal activist. So deployment enormous amounts of capital towards and all of this. And so Sam is like a crypto billionaire. And one of the things that ends up happening with these guys is they say a lot of the stuff that the tech industry says now. They say, listen, we need to hold on to this capital because we can deploy it better than everybody else. We're going to use all of our institutional knowledge and all of our statistics in order to give away to philanthropic causes that actually matter to us. And so we don't have to pay taxes anymore. So Sam moves down to Jamaica and he sets up his compound, and he's saying he's deploying all of this money. We're talking like close to $100 million, I think.
A lot of money.
An enormous amount of money. Like there was money given to Vox Media, which does their Future Perfect series, which is all about veganism. Ezra Klein, who is the editor-in-chief over at Vox Media. Everybody who works at Vox Media is an ethical vegan. They've all come up through, like, say, Mercy for Animals or any number of different causes. There are... who else are they giving it to? They were supposed to give $7.5 million to Our World in Data, which has never had anything good to say about animal agriculture ever. They said that they gave it back. I don't know if they've given money before. Gates Foundation obviously funds Our World in Data. They're heavily invested in plant-based meats. And so what you have, what you functionally had is like this complete like corporate takeover of a lot of media to push this specific agenda that was primarily moved to move us away from animal agriculture. And a lot of it was deployed darkly. Like sometimes it was a humble brag. Sometimes it was, you wouldn't see. Eventually, The Guardian, I think, was shamed into actually showing on there which articles were directly funded by the Open Philanthropy Project. But prior to that, I don't think they were showing that at all. So it just seemed like valuable reporting that was coming out of that. And so you just kind of like, you look at all of this stuff and you're like, so these are the organizations, and it's enormous amounts of money being deployed all over the planet to push people towards the removal of animal agriculture. And so Sam is it's a total scam. He was leveraging money that he said that he was buying for crypto for people on his exchange to take all of this money to deploy it in any myriad different ways that he wanted to. He is worth nothing now, but he's still being bailed out by somebody. It's $32 billion gone in. Yeah,
I think his bail was. It was insane. I don't want to misspeak. I feel like it was 250 million, but that feels absurd.
I think it was. Yeah,
it was 250 million.
But he did make bail because of a number of different things associated with it. He is staying at his parents' $4 million estate near Stanford University, and he'll do that through the entire trial. He wanted extradition to the United States because he didn't like his jail in Jamaica, and he could advocate for vegan meals while he was in prison, while he was here. So...
Wow, I didn't know my eyes rolled that far into the back of my head. I had missed that detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you look at the way that these guys have operated for a long time, so eventually effective altruism moved into this thing called long-termism, and it's a mathematical calculation that I talked about a little bit before. It's like, what is the value of a human today versus a value of the human in the future, and so for them it's about expanding the light of consciousness to the rest of the universe. And so the deployment of capital now doesn't matter about making this world better. It's about creating this sort of this future techno-utopian, society. And so they were deploying in many different ways that don't make that much sense anymore. And it's like any number of sort of schizophrenic institutions. They're like equally against AI, but also hoping that it'll happen, in the way that they describe. They're, any number of different things. But I do think what we'll find out over the next, through this trial and everything like that was how much money was actually being deployed and what they were doing to, in essence, sort of like, shame people into sort of moving away from animal agriculture altogether. But they've been just so dominant for so long. I think it's gonna be like one of those zombie studies that just never really goes away, like Livestock's Long Shadow or something like that.
Yeah, that has permeated the cultural conversation around this in a way that, and in a way that I actually find fascinating. I relate it to playing a game of telephone, and Livestock's Long Shadow being one example, where each reporter gets an assignment, or they come up with a piece that they want to do, and instead of examining where their views came from, right, how their view of animal agriculture and of food has been shaped, they just parrot this view that has become the quorum, the consensus within that community. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of this interview has spoken to how that quorum, how that consensus of our viewpoints gets cemented throughout time, and that it's no wonder that this is the case in all of these different spaces, because it's kind of in many ways been constructed in that way, and made in that way. And then on the other side of it, you have the rise of this billionaire class and this idea of long-termism, which I was not familiar with, and I'm grateful to have that one in my lexicon. This idea of long-termism and this techno-utopia that exists in some future way and is clean and is death-free, especially for those that are inhabiting it. And the way that all of those views have been shaped, this sort of bifurcation in society where you have this elite class and viewpoint and this other class, and the way that they link together through how things are being shaped and how things have been shaped over the last 100 years. I mean, this isn't just now. This is a cathexis of everything that has happened up until this point.
Yeah, I mean, look at the people advising Eric Adams are effective altruists. I mean, I've had conversations with them. These are people who are taking over governments, who are legislating, who are pushing any number of different buttons to promote this worldview. And I think that the problem with it is that, like, we're functionally distracted. There's just we're going from, like, it's like the San people of the Kalahari will kind of talk about, like, 1,000-year floods, or some traumatic event that kind of happened, like, they go over the courses of hundreds of years. They have maybe a deluge story or something like that. We go from goddamn crisis to crisis every day. It's so hard to, like, just pull yourself out of it and say any number of different things that are going on, like what matters, right? Yeah, and I do think that is somewhat difficult.
But like you said, in regards to a child learning about something, there has to be a delineation that not all things can matter to all people. I don't mean to say this. But that it has to be resonance, and there has to be some resonance for you. And I think that this striving to have all the knowledge of all the crises, all the things that matter going on, it's information overload for a human operating system that was never meant to consume this volume of information. And I think we are most effective and most purpose-driven, most joyful, most resonant when we engage with those things that matter to us, right? Like the animal agriculture conversation, the meat conversation, that's very resonant for me. There are any number of issues that other people might find resonance with. And I think it's important that, we're working as an entire culture, that there's pieces of this that are woven together.
Yeah, I have found within this conversation about globalization, the billionaire class, and any number of different things associated with that, which may seem like really far-flung, issues that you have absolutely no direct control over or anything like that. I don't think we can say that I'm hoping people understand that there are certain elements of the way that they operate that has a direct effect on your life. And so if the deployment of capital, your taxpayer dollars, don't go to helping farmers locally or within a community, or if billionaires start to move in the way that's happening outside of New York City in the Hudson Valley, brings up farming properties at a time when the Department of Agriculture is actually trying to move as much agriculture back up to the Northeast as possible because of all the droughts that are happening in the Southwest. So we see it. We're starting to see that there are a number of different ways that these guys who are sort of playing these games with people's lives are actually having a direct effect. And educating your children is in essence sort of one of those things. You have to understand that these guys have leveraged their power and their ability through PR campaigns and the way that they give to institutions like the media, so that the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. MSNBC, like that's a Gates, organization. Like the Guardian, every single one of these institutions has been sort of semi co-opted by these guys who actually functionally believe that they're better than us. Dumpy old Bill Gates. Like,
I mean, dumpy old Elon. They're both pretty dumpy. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had and it's never for you to say that it's your responsibility to know all of this stuff. I just want people to have pause so they understand that there is an enormous amount of pressure on, you're going to get it from your school. It's going to tell you that you're not doing enough for your children. Tell them to fuck off, I mean, that's the hardest part, but you're racing to nowhere, and when I get with my kids, when I get the you're sort of falling a little bit behind, I'm like, so that's your problem. But I have had pressure from any number of different institutions over the years to put my kids on some sort of medication, and it's always been no. And you're going to get it, and to understand that all of that stuff is going to have enormous effect on their development, their ability to know themselves, right? Because what you're doing is narcotizing their ability to know how to function in the world. When you go out and you say something horrible to somebody, and they look at you back in the face with that face that says, "Oh my God, I can't believe you said that," and you feel nothing, you've learned nothing from that experience. So and that is a hard thing to understand, that the way that they've sort of taken all of that stuff out of your world, so that you, in essence, you're underdeveloped in many different ways. I have a friend of mine who's he's one of my best friends. We were taking his kid out. His kid is Russian Jewish, and he is Bangladeshi, and it gets this beautiful skin tone. He's it's this really caramel colored beautiful child, and he was putting on SPF 50 as we were hiking in the forest, and I was like, "Come on!" Put a hat on him, SPF 50, as if sunlight was gonna just wipe this kid off the planet.
Meanwhile, that kid's vitamin D levels, we won't get into
Oh my God.
That kid's
yeah,
vitamin
but
D
he's,
levels
require
the sun to make something. It's not just,
I know.
It has a purpose.
So funny. Where do you want to go? Or are we winding down?
I mean, I'm good for whatever. I'm along for the ride. I think that there's a desire to kind of weave it together, right? To pull it all back into the space, which I think we've kind of done towards the end here, because I do think that that viewpoint is so important. And I've just gotten an education that I feel underread, which is it's a good feeling. It's good. It's good for me to feel a little underread.
Yeah.
Oh no, let me look at this. We didn't even talk about your background, but that's always my thing. My husband is like, you never talk to people about what they do, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think with sorry to go back. I'm talking about Brett too much. Hey, Brett, hope you're listening. But I think for him, his origin story was so interesting. Because I hadn't known that about him before. I'd been on his podcast, and I'm going to have him on for Sustainable Dish. But the level to which his whole system was completely compromised, and the way he brought himself back from that was pretty. Just the money that would be spent.
Stellar.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, millions of dollars just on I can't remember the name of it right now, but the drug.
We didn't even talk about Butchery. Let's talk about Butchery.
I know. That was my big thing was this question of, and now I think that question is even more potent for me. So as butchers, right, we get this really unique opportunity to see an animal's life from the inside out. We get to see those practices made carcass composition. And I'm even more curious now, having talked to you, like how you take that experience in such a formative years too. I think you were 14 when you started butchering, right? You take that experience and you spiral out and around to how this piece of meat becomes a part of culture and informs culture and all the ties to it. That's such a journey to make, and it's not linear, and it really interests me if that makes sense, because all of a sudden you go from looking at meat to teasing out all these different threads of the relationship that meat has to our culture, and within that space unpacking so much of how culture has been created.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's my father got me the job. It was the first job I ever had. I didn't know how to quit a job, so I ended up joining the military and then had to leave. So I 14 to 18, I was working with these guys who were old school Irish butchers. God, they drank. It was unbelievable. But they had owned this butcher store. It was part of a family for a very long time. And it was just completely just wiped out by supermarkets and big box stores and all this other stuff. I had never seen anything like it. I worked with these guys over the course of like I said, 4 years. And I didn't know how much it would actually affect my worldview at all. I didn't know, you deliver to people who spent their lives, in apartments. You delivered to, you walked into people's houses. A lot of people were shut-ins. A lot of people were in their 80s. They couldn't grocery shop anymore. And, you'd send all of your stuff out and you'd meet people come in. The fire department would come in and spend hundreds of dollars on meat. You would get Russian guys pay with food stamps and show up in a brand new BMW. You get just completely weird worldview. And then you're also in 74th Street in Roosevelt, which is there's 200, at the time, I think it was 250,000 people from the Indian subcontinent would come into this one 3-block radius that for shopping every single weekend. And there was everything was Indian owned businesses except for us and a Payless shoe store. That was the only thing that was left. And so it was just a really interesting experience. So you couple that with, my mom, who was a ballet dancer, who never really had a great relationship with food. I never got into cooking until later on, much, much later. With Amy, she was like, one of us is going to have to learn how to cook. And she was like, you. And so I went into it kicking and screaming, and then studied with some of like most wonderful
he
chefs
did.
in the world. And then ended up with these Irish butchers in London, working for a guy by the name of Jack O'Shea, who was like, I don't know what he was. He was like a rock star butcher who used to work at Selfridges. So he would, they had this huge counter at Selfridges, and Saudi billionaires would come in and they would buy like the entire counter of meat, and all this other stuff. So he was sort of this huge rock star butcher who had just opened up a place in this small like enclave in London. And I went to go apprentice with his guys. These were totally old school like Irish guys. The one guy, the main guy who I love this guy to death. He was like, oh man, he was like, yeah, I'm an alcoholic, so I don't drink anymore or anything like that. But man, those years like where I was just like drinking all the time, he would talk about him fondly. And then I've been with him for like 8 months, and he's like, hey, you want to go out for a beer? And I'm like, what? He's like, no, because you're an alcoholic. He's like, yeah, no. I don't drink spirits anymore, but I can drink beer all day. I drink beer all the time. Like a fucking Irishman.
Just whiskey. I don't drink whiskey.
Yeah, I just don't drink whiskey. But they were just really good. Like, so his brother-in-law he worked there. These guys, all they wanted to do was get on the property ladder. They had bought council estates, which are like, these sort of low-income apartments that used to be used for kind of welfare, but they could buy into them. He wanted to leave something for his next generation of kids. He wanted to kind of create wealth. These guys worked so hard. And the way that they broke down animals was so completely different than the American style. Just very, very different.
That's how we cut.
Yeah.
Yeah, we cut very European.
Oh, cool. And so, yeah, I mean, they were just really like, just happy to serve people. And we had vegan protesters. They would come in, every time Jack O'Shea was in town, they would like protest, and, the butcher's son would go out and ask the girls out for dates, and, they didn't really understand it. And, but it was really great. I like being 38 and seeing it from the inside. Just the level to which these guys just weren't being paid. Jack had a restaurant in Belgium that ended up going under. He got heavily involved in drugs, and I think he kind of sort of fell off the radar. But when we were filming Sacred Cow, I met the butcher who is part of the initial part of the film. He has a 2 Michelin star restaurant in Belgium. He has another restaurant that it kind of took over Jack O'Shea's restaurant in Belgium. So it was a weird confluence of times in my life, because these guys all kind of knew each other. And Dieren Dank is the butcher, who is just such a great guy, like just so warm-hearted and just willing to teach. And the best butcher shop I've ever seen in my life, like by far. Just used every part of the animal he could get his hands on.
I mean, I'm biased.
I know.
I think Western Daughters is the best.
Yeah. I gotta come over and hang out.
Yeah, I mean, if you're ever in Denver, let us know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. 10 years old this month.
Oh, cool.
Has been that we've been using every last part, but
yeah,
there's something really magical about Butchery for me, in that you have an opportunity to see how everything is connected, and I mean at a really granular level, to see the fascia that winds through our whole body, that is in. You can't tease it out from one another, right? It's all one piece of fascia as you pull off a short rib plate, or as you peel off a top round, and it's all connected, and it creates this organism. And then you get to see the impacts that of farming and ranching practices. I mean, I've been cutting grass-fed beef for the last decade, but when I learned, I was doing corn-fed beef. But you get to see the season, and you get to see the rotations, and you get to see the different diets made manifest in in these muscles and in the color of fat and all of these different things. And I think one of the gifts of that is you begin to see just what a complex puzzle we are, and just how much influence there is for every piece of our biology. And I think it's easy to extrapolate that outwards and say that you can look at how complex the culture that makes up all of these systems. Just gives you a very different lens through which to view life and living. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think even just if you're the level to which we actually don't have any understanding of the fascia is now just starting to be sort of brought out in the fitness community. Like, so much power comes from that, like this sleeve that governs, like, how you feel and the way that you move. And
James Oshman calls it the living matrix. That the collagen that makes up fascia, the living matrix.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. There's a lot of rehab, a lot of people working in rehab are so heavily focused on that right now. Because we can see the degeneration of it, right? We're seeing it in the human body as we go. I don't know. I mean, some part of me says we're getting there. Right? Like that, when I have these conversations, I'm like, we're getting there. We're starting to figure it out. Like, we're starting to realize that that the dung beetle is a keystone species. They're starting to realize that predator-prey relationships actually functionally make nature and ecosystems healthier. We're starting to see like that we can create a world that like we would want to live in. And there are all of these different like elements of that. And I'm just trying to like get all those people together. That's what our films are about, right? That's what Death in the Garden is about. It's like, is to understand that nature isn't something that we have to subjugate. That we can't, we have such a need for domination in the way that we think about all of this stuff. I was recently, I don't know if you've ever been to, I always forget, it's the poulet rouge. Have you ever had a poulet rouge? There are a number of different birds that are raised in France that are considered like national birds. Very, very different from the American chicken. They look like dinosaurs. And the leg is the predominant meat. The breast is actually really small. But the fat is just yellow. It's just a completely different experience to go and eat that. And what you're doing is actually eating a lot less protein. What you are eating is something that is so highly satisfying that you just don't like. You're satiated. Like you eat food and you're like, oh my God, I'm satiated. Like this is what it feels like. And you just realize like we start moving back to this. Like I think we have one company that does all the genetics for chickens. Two companies.
Two companies. Aviagen and somewhere I have it in my notes. I talked about it with Frank Reese fairly recently, but it's two companies that own all of the genetics for chickens, and they're functionally they don't work, like the breeds don't work, and they're so far down the line that they're sterile, and these genetics are essentially patented. It's a fascinating process. I did a really deep dive into this with Jed Greenberg and Frank Reese, who's part of the Good Shepherd Poultry Conservancy, and it's a fascinating thing. But I haven't had a poulet rouge, but we raise sometimes like really old line barred rock roosters.
Yeah.
For eating, and it has nothing to do with a chicken.
Yeah. Have you? Do you know Mark Schatzker?
I know of him.
Yeah. He had a great book, The Dorito Effect, where he talks about getting a barred rock. But yeah, he goes kind of really deeply into our search and the need for nutrients and why we're ending up in this place where we're constantly eating but never satisfied. Yeah, he's a really interesting character. Yeah, I don't know. The sort of the butchery element of it is I just think is really it should be part of the curricula. I remember there was a story when I was over in the UK where there was a school, I think it was in Scotland, that was breaking down a whole pig. And the vegan community, nowhere near there, didn't even live near there, were up in arms about it. So they ended up getting it shut down. But I think it's just so integral to. We should bring back like cooking classes. That's we should stop divorcing people from every aspect of modern life and say that they're not ready yet, because by the time they're 18, they're not going to be ready for a long time.
Yeah, home ec.
Yeah,
home ec should come back. Yeah. And could be even more enlightened and fun and involved. I mean, butchery and farming, and because to me that's part of home ec too, right? Like butchering and farming and cooking and all of these different pieces, they're vital.
Yeah, we had the local community school here had a $25 million grant to build their ag program. I think there's just a lot happening in the Northeast to sort of build this stuff back. It is exciting. You see the sort of simultaneous, like, local aspect of it that's trying to build a relationship with their farming communities, and then you see also the other side of it, which is the large cities that are a number of different people. I don't know if you're following a lot of the acreage that's being sold over to green energy. What do you call it? Solar panels.
Like solar? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I see it. I see it in this area.
Yeah, fertile farmland. Like, I'll pay you $1,000 a year per acre. Just convert this whole thing so that we can get energy. To plastic.
Just convert it to plastic. I mean, it's just all plastic. We didn't get in, and I think we could talk for hours, and we should probably wrap up. But the idea of a sunshine study, Wes Jackson has this idea of looking at the energy inputs for any given thing, right? And they did a whole sunshine farm over there at the Land Institute at one point. But this idea of a sunshine study being that if I take a tractor and I look at the energy inputs that it took to mine the iron ore to make the steel, and I could extrapolate it really far out, right? I could go all the way to the gas that it takes as the steel lobbyist sits in DC traffic. Mm-hmm. And I could begin to look at all of these inputs that go into making this thing that's going to make our techno-utopia so perfect, right, and ask whether or not it's really any better than this other thing. And there's a solar farm. I guess we call them a solar farm. That's good. I haven't thought about it in context. There's this solar farm on our drive into town. We're about an hour from the nearest town, and it is just an eyesore. It just feels like the most foreign and alien place I can imagine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so weird to me. So you talked about BlackRock before. So Larry Fink was he's the CEO of BlackRock, but he's an interesting character because he lost most of his fortune. I don't remember. It was 87. It was one of the crashes. He lost most of his fortune. He ended up, he wanted to create this supercomputer, right? And he set it up somewhere in like Washington State. It's like their other export, the town's main export, I think, is apples. And he set up this like supercomputer. He's like, I'm never gonna not have enough information so that I can like govern everything, wave heights and air quality and weather systems and soil fertility. All this data is going to be aggregated in my supercomputer, and I'm just going to make so much money. Well, this guy, he never saw 2008, never saw the mortgage crisis. He never saw it. The supercomputer is crunching numbers all day long, and he never saw it. Now, he's insulated because after the 2008 crash, they actually hired him to go and deal with all of the buyback of all the stocks. So like, no matter what happens, these guys are too big to fail. But it is interesting to me that like we built this like worldview where like this thing, this
digitize light emitting, diodes and all of this stuff, we can somehow know the universe. And it is semi-religious. Like we can crunch all the numbers and we'll get it all right. We'll never lose our money again, and that's Sam Bankman-Fried, right? He almost guaranteed that the money would go up forever, that your money was safe within his financial institution,
But if you understand anything about nature, you understand that there's always an upper limit, right? That there is no such thing as growth in perpetuity. Right. At least not as nature has ever conceived of it. And I don't know if we can break that ceiling, and I have no idea why we would try. And I think one of my greatest joys, one of our ranchers for Western Daughters, raises sheep, and he has a contract with IBM to graze their solar farm. And so the sheep keep the grass mowed underneath these solar panels. And it turned into an issue when the sheep started biting the cords that that allowed everything through. And I think in some ways there's an analogy there that you can't anticipate. You can't anticipate it. You can't anticipate the unknown. You can't break yourself against it. And of course, I don't think that we can conquer nature.
Yeah. Remember they were putting masks on cattle to mitigate and measure the methane that was coming out of them? And every farmer was like, do you know how quickly these cows will get that caught in something?
Instantaneously. Instantaneously. Like our running joke on the farm is like, cows are why we can't have nice things. Like you set something up and you're like, this is cow proof. And then sure enough, we got our milk cow. First milk cow I ever had, bought her an eye mask, like for horses. But horses, again, we talked, horses are poorly made and maybe more civilized, and not in a good way, in the way that we've been talking. We got her this fly mask, and I mean, it lasted 4 hours, and it was broken and buried. It's done. Can't do this.
Yeah, but I do love I love it when you get the because Wired fucking loves this shit. Like all the technology magazines, they love this stuff. But they had do you remember when they did virtual reality for dairy cattle, so that they can get more cows, they can get more milk out of them, so they would put them in grass fields and stuff like that. I just love it. It's like just the total absurdity of modern civilization.
Total absurdity. Yep.
Yeah.
And the disconnect of, grass helps them produce more milk. Being in a natural environment and seeing, seeing a horizon or seeing things that make their organism what it is conducive to increased yield and increased pleasure, maybe, however we want to define or label that, increased resonance with their environment.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. I'm pretty sure we could talk all day.
Yep.
We'll have all of this in the show notes along with an excellent reading list that I am legitimately excited to dig into, though I have a feeling that you're holding out and I could get more reading recommendations out of you over time. But this is a really good reading list. Do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely recommend the Gatto stuff, John Taylor Gatto. And he's got 2 books that are very short. And then the other one that goes into it. Where you can find me, I'm trying to be so I'm primarily on Primate Kitchen. I will post on there. Meg, who used to post for me because it's the one thing I actually hate doing.
Me too.
I'm transferring because she's doing some amazing stuff and writing about regen ag and stuff like that. So I'm looking for somebody new. So if you know anybody. So Primate Kitchen is where I'm like posting all of the weird shit that is my worldview to kind of like get people surrounded around this idea that like, like we're measuring the wrong things or whatever, just absurdities and shit talk and all of that stuff. I am on Twitter for James Co Photo. It's not my best self. I find it very difficult to. It triggers me in many different ways, and some of it is my fault because I follow like a lot of the people that I shouldn't follow. So I think in 2023 I'm just gonna post as opposed to like shit post.
Engaging.
Going to try, but yeah, you can find me on that as well, or just reach out. I don't know, like DM me on on Instagram if you find me. Tell me I'm full of shit.
Just engage you more. Okay. I think these are great. I'm really grateful for you for coming on the podcast and for this crash course in history that had escaped my knowledge, and a lot of excitement around what there is to dive into following this interview.
Cool. Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. Cool.